Hello everybody, welcome back. Glad to see the room still as full now as it was this morning. In fact, I think I can see some new faces. Can I just refer you and remind you about the debate questions? Please do think about how you might address each of them, possibly in order, because we will be treating them in order. And if you've got any comments to make or any questions that come off the back of the questions that are listed on the PowerPoint slide here, please do hold them, perhaps write them down, and we do want to create as much debate this afternoon as possible. It's really about handing the floor over to you. But before that, I'd like to introduce Pat Cochrane, a Bridge colleague of mine, who I find incredibly inspirational as well. We're just packed with inspiration, Bridge organisations. Pat Cochrane is Chief Executive of CAPE UK, the Bridge in Yorkshire and Humber. And Pat has a long track record of supporting action research programmes. And alongside Yvette, can I just read this so that I don't miss anything out? Alongside Yvette, Pat has worked with regional coordinators to help frame reflection and draw together learning from each of the regions. Both of them have got a wealth of insights about the challenges of implementing an action research influenced approach across multiple and complex partnerships, and actually that has probably been the biggest challenge for us all. We're quite spread apart, so it'd be interesting to hear what Pat and Yvette found about the complexities and the challenges of working in that way. Both of them are highly experienced in embedding reflective practice in project design and supporting practitioners to reflect on and analyse their work. And I think Pat's presentation is going to take you through the approach that we embedded in Strong Voices right from the start, in order to draw out the learning and take an exploratory approach, I couldn't say that word then, exploratory approach right from the very start. So they've been absolutely integral to the whole process, and I can't wait to hear what Pat and Yvette found out together. Yvette's over there, if you want to stand up, Yvette, and introduce yourself, because I believe that you have played a very key role. Pat Cochrane.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. Trying to be inspiring on a Friday afternoon is an interesting challenge. Strong Voices. You've all had an opportunity so far today to dip into aspects of the Strong Voices programme. And I've got the task of explaining some of how we analysed and worked with partners to draw out the learning, really. And like other speakers, I want to emphasise that Strong Voices is building on an incredibly rich tradition of work with vulnerable and disadvantaged young people in this country through the arts. This is not a new area of work, and I'm sure we've got people in the room who've got years of expertise in this work. So we recognise that, but we are working in a different context. And so when we put this big bid in and, rushed to get the bid to the DFE, and it was highly competitive, we made the decision that we didn't need to do an evaluation as such. We didn't need to get another evaluation report on the pile of evaluation reports that probably exist up and down the country about the difference the arts can make to the lives of vulnerable children and young people. What we wanted to do was to get underneath the processes. We wanted to really understand what was happening and what was happening in a new context. So what is action research? This is going to sound very simple to those of you that have been involved in it, and the reality is that one has to have some rather simple scaffolding structures, but what's going on is really messy. And what we're trying to do is make sense of all the huge complexity of the work that we're doing. And for us, for Yvette and myself, working on the action research, it was an incredible privilege to see what was going on across the country, because there were hundreds of practitioners involved in 5 regions, I think probably about 60 locations, thousands of young people, and so all that you've seen is a tiny little dip into it. So, at its simplest, action research is about having a question, having something you want to inquire about, planning how you might have an impact on that, carrying it out, and then, which I think is the thing that those of us in the arts and cultural sector tend not to devote quite enough time to, is to reflect, assess, and go back into the cycle. So we wanted to do a really deep dive into the practice in order to get cycles of reflection going on. And this morning you've had opportunities to look at that. Now you've already seen this diagram looking slightly different. Programme at the middle, translate that into young people. So right across the programme, different regions were focusing on the needs, the specific needs of different groups of young people. But we were immediately hit with the fact that in order to get funding from the Department for Education, you have to say that you're going to hit all sorts of targets, very ambitious targets. You have to report on those targets regularly. You have your own organisational agendas, so it might be my agenda in my organisation to work with vulnerable young people, but somebody else's agenda is to get as many young people or get as many people into the building as possible. So every single partner that was involved in the programme was navigating multiple complexities. And one of the big challenges that we had is that nothing stood still, because we all know that in the last few years we've been working in a time of austerity, cuts, reorganisation, changes to structures and systems which seem to come hard and fast on us. And in this programme we were dependent, we really needed to be working with the same people, because you can't grow knowledge, you can't grow an understanding of practice if the people that you're talking to change all the time. So it was very challenging. So here we have it. Terribly simple, isn't it? Think of an inquiry question. Not so simple. So what is it in my practice? I'm going to run this particular piece of work. I'm going to think about what I want to achieve, but what am I trying to find out by doing this particular intervention? So finding the inquiry question, deciding what it is, narrowing it down into what you really want to find out is quite challenging. Especially in my experience in arts programmes, because arts and cultural programmes, we're kind of geared up to getting on with the work, making something happen, making an intervention, producing something exciting. So what did we do? We flipped the format of nearly all of our work. So there were 5 regions working on this programme, and we met across the country in regional teams. So we had a day every quarter to reflect on what we were doing, a planning day. My experience of those kinds of meetings is usually that you come along, you have a discussion, you talk about targets, you talk about where you've got to the targets, you sort of compete with each other about how good your work is and what intervention you've made, but you don't often manage to have a rich conversation. So what we as a consortium decided to do was to take all the logistics as far as possible out of those regional meetings, and when we had those precious days together, to reflect on what was really going on in the practice. And I've been in discussions this morning about how valuable that's been. We definitely found it incredibly refreshing to be having conversations about the practice itself. So we met quarterly, and in those quarterly sessions, what Yvette and I tried to do was to model some of the processes of action research. So how do you decide what your priority is? how do you focus in on a question? Once you've focused in on a question, what are you going to do and how are you going to know that you've made a difference? What kind of evidence are you going to be able to collect? And then as the programme went on, we pulled back to what we call the through line. So we kept trying to come back to, so are we really making a difference? Are we really still focusing on what it is that we decided we wanted to focus on? Does that make sense? Sometimes when you get involved in a project, you start with this objective at the beginning and you end up way over there, and you have to have a little bit of reflection to say, actually, we were trying to do this, but now we're doing that. So where do we want to put our energies? What the regions then did is they went back to their areas, decided what to do, implemented it, developed all sorts of rich ways of encouraging reflective practice. So people were talking to each other using YouTube, they were phoning each other, they were gathering together in meetings, having reflective sessions. And we, between those sessions, mainly I have to say that, had phone calls, talked to the regional coordinators, supported them in the process of reflection that they were going through. So it was an iterative process that went on through the 2 years. So just a tiny model. We'd spend a session talking about what makes a good inquiry question. Well, it's actually got to be a question. That sounds obvious, but a lot of times people aren't genuinely asking a question. It's got to be appropriate. So let's say that we can change the whole world in a 2-year programme with limited resources. What can we really have an impact on? And it's got to be something that's going to interest and excite us, excite the sector as a whole. What difference would it make? So, say I'm working in the museum sector and I'm doing some really interesting work. Is it something that will interest other people in the sector? Is it potentially going to have some impact? Now, just for a moment, I'd like you to reflect on today what your key questions are. You've had those ones, but do you actually ever have space within your practice to pause and reflect? And those of us that are in the online audience, just think about how much time in the last week have you given yourself to reflect on what you're doing? It's hard, isn't it? So what we found, I'm aware of time and I know you want to get on to the big questions. What we found is that you did have to have a rigour and a discipline to make yourself come back to that, because otherwise it's just too easy to get on to the next process. Our key finding that's come out, which I think resonates with lots of people who've been involved with creative partnerships, is that what we were trying to do was bring together two different worlds, and again I'm oversimplifying because there were all sorts of different worlds coming together, but basically we were bringing together sets of people whose main focus was arts and culture with sets of people whose main focus was driven by youth and community practice. And this is a really extreme end of the continuum that I'm modelling up here, but we found all over the regions that similar things were going on. So that the youth work orientation tended to focus on enabling young people to make small steps to improve their lives, to improve their ability to function in the real world. And so for somebody from a youth and community background, you know, using the bus to get to a session could have been a real triumph. Whereas from the arts and cultural sector, there tends to be much more of a focus on a product, the need to attend consistently to achieve an outcome. The skill of the arts practitioner tends to be in the art form, the skill of the youth practitioner tends to be in understanding the dynamics and the ways in which young people, vulnerable young people, need support. And in the 42nd Street presentation, there was quite a clear statement about we don't want to turn cultural practitioners into youth workers, nor do we want to turn youth workers into arts and cultural practitioners. What we want to do is to create a space where there's a shared language and we're navigating and creating new shared understandings. And I think that goes back to something Catherine said. And that's much harder than I think any of us ever anticipated. And I thought there was a lovely comment quite early on in our gatherings about strong voices where in the Northwest there was this finding that the youth and community sector were completely fed up with arts and cultural organisations turning up, having got some money from a trust to work with marginalised young people, turning up at an organisation saying, we've got money to work with your kids. It didn't go down well. So the challenge in all this work is to create the partnerships. And I think the big challenge for us as a sector, and I know it was one of the questions up there, is how we grow that community of practice, because it's a community of practice of practitioners in the cultural sector, but also practitioners that are focused on youth and community. And how do we get a shared dialogue? Now, I know that there are national programmes working on this now, so the Paul Hamlin Arts Work programme, there's a programme Tate Liverpool and Tate and Whitworth are involved in. But we have to somehow grow the practice in a significant way. And I firmly believe that the only way that we can do that is by drawing people together and creating spaces for people to have genuine dialogue. So what did we find the key ingredients were? And sorry, this is your bullet-pointed list, but I want to draw your attention to the one in the middle, because that's come through over and over again. And I think the most critical thing for effective action research and reflective practice to take place, which is collaborative, is that it's not competitive, that there really is a climate of trust developed where people can explore what they think is working without it sounding like they're bragging, and what they think isn't working without feeling that they're exposing their vulnerabilities. We really have to have a climate of open conversation and exploration. And in order to have that, we have to consciously create that. What we found in managing the programme, leading the action research dynamic nationally, was that some organisations were far more ready to open up to this particular approach because they already had a culture of reflection and review and inquiry. And others were in different space and were quite understandably, because of the pressures that we're all under, were in a space where actually the outputs are the most important thing. I've got to hit that target. And we did find it in the programme. We found that we had to really be careful about getting that balance right, because there were times when Katie, who hasn't been profiled enough at this conference, who handled all the monitoring side and the links with DFE, would get back to us saying, I need to know this piece of data, I need to know these outputs. And anybody who's managing an output-related project has a challenge in terms of keeping that space for reflection, but it's terribly important. So I knew that I was coming on at the last bit and you wouldn't be able to add questions onto the list, so I've pre-prepared a couple of questions in Blue Peter style. And my big question is, to what extent can you be genuinely reflective in a short-term, output-related programme of funding? And we've tried really hard to do that. We seem to be destined to work within short-term funding in the long term, and we've got to work out ways of building a culture and a community that can ride that out. so that we're not constantly flipping into a new project. And then I think it's one of the questions that came up as well, is how within a sector where people tend to be working on short-term contracts as well, there isn't that much continuity of employment, how can we genuinely build knowledge so that we're growing a really genuine community of practice? But finally, and I didn't put this up here because this had come to me during the day, is that we have got all this evidence about what works and what works with children and young people, how engagement with arts and culture, with museums, with heritage and so on transforms young people's lives. But we still seem to have to start the conversation right at the beginning when we go to talk to people from different sectors. So, for example, I've been in discussion with commissioners in a large local authority around a youth at-risk programme, and they're keen to integrate the arts. But I'm convinced that what we're talking about are short-term activities to keep young people occupied, rather than the kind of deep learning programmes that we know can make a difference. So what can we do? And I think we've managed to do quite a lot of this within Strong Voices, but there's still work to be done. What can we do to produce strong enough evidence to make people understand what it is that makes a difference, so that we're not always having to have the same discussion? So there's a challenge. And I've got a question for those members of the audience who are commissioners, because I would like to know whether what we're arguing is actually possible within a commissioning environment, or whether the priority is so much about having to deliver to challenging targets in a cost-effective way that creating space for reflection and time and growing knowledge and understanding just is going to be really difficult to fund and resource. So if there are any commissioners in the room or in the audience, I'd be really interested to know what your answer to that one is. So I've overgone my time, and I'm going to pass over to Derry, and I think Catherine's coming up to chair the discussion. I hope you've had a really good day, and the day isn't yet over. I just want to finish off by reiterating what an absolute privilege it has been to work with the regional partners and to dip into some of the practice in the localities, because it has been absolutely outstanding.
Thanks, Pat.